In the last video, we talked about reconnaissance, or how attackers learn more about the target that they will then be attacking. In this video, we're going to be talking about the vulnerability identifications and initial access stages of an attack. So we're going to be taking that information that we got from our scans, finding vulnerabilities, and using those vulnerabilities to gain an initial foothold or access to a target. First, we're going to take the attacker's perspective, and we're going to learn offense. We're going to talk about how attackers actually identify vulnerabilities, and then we're going to talk about how they use those vulnerabilities to then gain initial access to your machine. From there, we're going to switch perspectives and talk about how you can defend against this. We're going to talk, first of all, about how you can remove the vulnerability after you've identified it yourself so that an attacker cannot use that to get in. And we're going to talk about how to identify when an attack happens, figure out how an attacker actually got in. That will also help us identify the vulnerability so then we can go ahead and remove it. When it comes to actually identifying an attack, there are two places where attackers will leave evidence of compromise or indicators of compromise. The first one is in the network traffic. So we can use a network monitoring tool like Wireshark, like we did in the last video, to find evidence of an attacker generating malicious traffic that's associated with the attack. The second way we can find an attack is by looking for the logs for the actual service that the attacker targeted. So the attacker's way in is going to be through some service that was left exposed or publicly accessible on our machine. And by monitoring the logs for that individual service, we can see how the attacker took advantage of that service and used that to gain their initial access. Before we get hands-on, I want to bring your attention to this GitHub repository that I mentioned in a previous video. Again, if you don't remember how to get there, you can get there by going to github.com/redefiningreality/linux-defense-materials. Anyway, when you get to this GitHub repository, if you scroll down, I want you to, under the Linux defense section, click on attack vectors. If you ever forget any of the attack vectors that I'll be talking about in this video, you can always reference this cheat sheet. In this cheat sheet, I put the most common services that you're likely to see, and I listed attack vectors associated with each service. In addition, if you want to remember how to interact with that service, I left a link at the top to my red team manual that I use when performing attacks against these services. So if I click to open my red team manual, you'll see first of all that you have a list of ports and common services that are associated with those ports. And then on the side, you'll have different sections that you can click on to learn more about how to interact with that service. For example, if I go to FTP, I can see this is how I can interact with the FTP service. Going back to the list I just showed you, one thing you might notice is that under each of these services, one of the first attack vectors that I list is outdated service. This is because it's one of the first things an attacker will look for when they're attacking you. After they get back the results of their Nmap scan, they'll probably have an understanding of what services are accessible on your machine and also what version of each of those services you're running. Sometimes those versions can be outdated, and if they're outdated enough, there might be a publicly known way of attacking that version of the service. That's the first thing we're going to take a look at. And we're going to do that by taking a look at FTP. FTP, which stands for File Transfer Protocol, is used for exchanging files over the internet. So generally, there's one machine that acts as a server where all the files are stored, and then other machines can connect to that server, and they can upload files, download files, move, rename files, or otherwise modify that file system. If the version of the service that's running FTP on that server is too far outdated, an attacker could use a publicly known vulnerability to gain access to that server. Going over to my attacking machine, let's say my target has IP address 10.0.0.11. Right away, I'm just letting you know that I'm also monitoring network traffic in Wireshark as a defender, so that then I can go back and see what the attack that I performed looked like. But as an attacker, knowing that my target is 10.0.0.11, I'm going to scan it with Nmap. Let's say, just for the sake of making this scan faster, I'm only going to scan port 21, which is running an FTP service. And I want to get the version of the service and also run the default Nmap scripts against that service. Again, my target was 10.0.0.11. If I run that Nmap scan, you can see that port 21 is open. It's running vsftpd version 2.3.4, and it gives me some additional information about it, such as, for example, that anonymous FTP login is allowed. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. But first, let's take a look at this FTP version, vsftpd 2.3.4. What I like to do is I like to take that version name and go online, go in my web browser, and search it along with the word exploit. So I'm going to google.com and I'm searching vsftpd 2.3.4 exploit. An exploit is just a way of getting access to something. So if exploitation is the process of attacking someone to gain access, an exploit is how the attacker is actually going about doing that. I'm going to ignore this first link for now. That's to Rapid7. That's just going to talk about the Metasploit module available for taking advantage of this vulnerability. Metasploit is a framework used by attackers to make exploits easier to run without having to understand how it works. But I'm actually going to look at the second link here, which is to exploit-db. Now, if you see exploit-db.com, that's a very good indicator that maybe there is actually a way in. So exploit-db, or the exploit database, is a publicly available database where people will put code that can be used to take advantage of different vulnerabilities. In this case, we have vsftpd 2.3.4, which is exactly the version that we're running, and you can see that it has a backdoor command execution. Before we go ahead and blindly run this code, which you should never do, we're first going to take a look at it and see how it works. I want to stress that you should never run code that you get from the internet without first looking through it and understanding how it works, because a lot of people will try to trick you by putting code that maybe actually does something malicious or connects back to you instead of what it says it's supposed to do. And so that's why it's important to review any proof of concept code that you find online. Looking at this code, for those of you who are not as programmer savvy, I'm just going to try to dumb it down. So really, the important part of the code starts here where we have this telnet. So it initiates a connection to some machine host that's defined as an argument using port 21. Now, port 21 is the standard port for FTP. It reads until it gets this text, vsftpd 2.3.4. When it reads that text, it looks like it writes this user variable. And that user variable has the contents user nergal : back parenthesis, or smiley face, as I like to call it. Then from there, it reads again until it finds the word password with a period. Then it writes this password variable, which contains pass. Finally, it leaves that connection open, but at the same time, it starts a second telnet connection to the same machine on port 6200. From there, it starts an interactive telnet session. Now that we understand how this code works, we could actually take it and we could run it and see if it actually gives us access to that machine. However, instead of doing that, just to very clearly illustrate what this code is doing, I want to take each of these steps manually and see what happens. The first thing that the code did was start a telnet connection to the target on port 21. Rather than use telnet, in Kali Linux, I'm going to use a different tool called netcat that accomplishes the same thing. Basically, it creates a raw TCP connection. You can use netcat by saying NC. If I want to connect to the target on port 21, I'll say netcat 10.0.0.11, which is my target, and 21, which is the port. This is pretty much the equivalent of using telnet in Python, which is the language the code we previously looked at was written in. From there, the code waits until it receives vsftpd 2.3.4 in parentheses. Once it receives that, it sends back capital user nurgle followed by a smiley face. If you were to read up on this vulnerability, you would learn that it's really this smiley face at the end of the username that's responsible for spawning the backdoor. After it sends that, it waits until it reads password followed by a period. And once it reads that, it sends back capital PASS followed by lowercase PASS. You could specify any password you want. Again, it doesn't matter, but just to follow the code exactly, I will enter the same details. Once that runs, you'll notice the process hangs, and if you remember from that code, it actually left that telnet session running, and then it started a new one that connects on port 6200. So I'm actually going to leave this running, and I'm going to open a new terminal tab. I'm also going to zoom in so you can see it a little bit better. And then I'm going to start a new session on port 6200. So again, I'll use netcat. The IP address or the target stays the same. And this time I'm connecting over port 6200. The next thing, or the last thing I should say that the code did is started an interactive session. So that means you could enter commands. So let me just try entering a command like who am I? You'll notice that taking advantage of this vulnerability, not only did we gain initial access to the target, but we gained initial access as the root user. I can do pretty much anything you would do in a command line, including list files, which there don't seem to be any, print the current working directory, which is the root's home directory, and perform any other actions. Now let's talk about how, as defenders, we can both catch an attacker performing this attack, and we can remove the vulnerability so that it's no longer exploitable and so that attackers can no longer use it to get into your machine. Going back to our traffic capture in Wireshark, let's take a look at the attacker's actions from a defensive perspective, or from the perspective of somebody monitoring network traffic. The first thing that the attacker did, as you can see here, is scan port 21. I can right-click on this packet, click Follow, TCP stream, to view the full back and forth exchange. So the attacker sent a SYN packet to the target on port 21. The target replied, acknowledged that they're open, and responded with that SYN back to the attacker, and then the attacker reset the connection. So here the attacker learned that port 21 is open. Then, as a result of running the default nmap scripts, nmap actually reached out to that port using the FTP protocol to gain more information about it. We can see this by right-clicking on any of these FTP packets and selecting Follow TCP Stream. As you can see, it looks like the nmap scanning tool didn't really send any data. It just connected. It probably read this banner to figure out the version of the service that was running, and then it kind of exited. And the FTP service errored out saying, hey, we didn't receive any data. After nmap ran the default scripts, connected some other information, you could see, for example, here Nmap is logging in as the anonymous user. So if I follow this TCP stream here, you can see that it logged in anonymously. It listed the files that are present and then it quit. That's probably why, if we look back at that Nmap scan, we got that FTP anonymous login allowed, and it showed the files that were listed when logged in anonymously. Anyway, after that, let's take a look at where the actual attack happened. So the first thing we did is we connected on port 21, and we entered a username of Nurgle and a password of pass. So I'm just going to guess that that's going to be right around here. I see some FTP traffic. I'm going to right-click, follow TCP stream. And as you can see, we have the back and forth between the attacker and the target. So the attacker connected via FTP. The target sent back this banner. The attacker sent user Nurgle. The target said, please specify the password. And then the attacker gave it a password of pass. The next thing, so I'm going to close out of this and I'm going to clear this filter here. The next thing is we connected over port 6200 and started entering commands. So here you can see some connections to and from port 6200 on the target. If I right-click on any of these packets, again select follow and TCP stream, this pulls up the raw traffic on port 6200, which is exactly the commands that we entered and the response that we got back from the target. I'm going to once again close out of that and clear this filter. So the biggest takeaway from looking at this network traffic is every single action that an attacker takes, as long as it's done in clear text and not encrypted, is viewable by us as defenders. The hardest part as a defender is sifting through all of this traffic and trying to figure out what in here is actually malicious. This becomes even more complicated when there's scoring users or just regular users that are also interacting with these same services. So one thing we could do is, for example, we know that an attacker, when they gain initial access, a lot of the times they'll run commands like who am I or ls. Those are some examples of popular commands an attacker would run. So what we can do is we can actually search the content of all of this traffic, and we can see if who am I appears anywhere in the traffic. In order to do that, I have to open a more advanced search bar here, which I can do by going to Edit and Find Packet. From here, instead of searching for a display filter, we want to search for a string, and we want that string to be inside the packet bytes. So I'm going to click on this packet list here and switch it to packet bytes. The actual string that we're searching for is the text who am I. So just running that, and I just pressed enter, but you can also click find, you'll notice it right away takes us to this packet right here. And if I were to right click on this packet and say follow TCP stream, again, you see the full back and forth that the attacker had with the victim. Examining these packets further, you can see that the traffic was sent to and received from port 6200 on the victim. Now that we know the timestamp of around when this happened, we can actually go back and see what else happened around that time. So right before this, let's see what happened. Well, it seems like right before this, we have some connections on port via FTP on port 21. So if I right click and I follow that TCP stream there, now we see that somebody, the attacker, connected to the target on port 21 and entered a username of Nurgle smiley face and a password of pass. So this is just one example of how when you get creative with filters, you can right away find something malicious that an attacker did, jump directly to where that is in the traffic, and then kind of work your way backwards to figure out how the attacker got there. The other place where we can find evidence of the attack is in the log files on the target machine. So the actual service that the attacker attacked was vsftpd. So if we read the log files for that service, we might gain some more information about what the attacker did. If you're unsure of where the log files are for a specific service, I think the best way of figuring it out is just looking it up. So I'm going to go on Google and look up vsftpd log file location. And we can go to this first link here. And it seems like by default, the log file location is in var log vsftpd.log. And while this is for Ubuntu, it's very likely to be the same for other distributions of Linux, like the one we're using in this case, which is Debian. Going back to this time, the machine that got attacked, I'm going to print out the contents of that log file. So I'll say cat var log vsftpd.log. Another thing I'll do is I'll prefix this with sudo because, again, I'm running as user rather than as root, and so I may not have permissions to print out that file, so I'm just going to print it out as root. And right here, you can see that we don't get quite as much information as we got when examining the traffic, but we do get some information, like, for example, that somebody connected to us multiple times, right? We even get some information here that somebody connected to us anonymously with password IE user at. That's probably the result of our Nmap scan here. So as a defender, you would really use a combination of monitoring these log files and monitoring network traffic. Generally, everything you need to know about what an attacker did will be in the network traffic. However, the problem is there's usually a lot to sift through. The log files can be an excellent starting point because they give you a big picture overview of how that service has been interacted with and maybe if there's potentially something suspicious going on. It also gives you a time when that happened that then you can cross-reference with your network traffic and dig in there and see exactly what the attacker did. Now let's take a look at how I would actually go about removing this vulnerability so that an attacker can't take advantage of it again. This same process works for any outdated service. And really, what our goal here is to update the service to a newer version that is no longer vulnerable. The first thing I like to check is if the service has a package that's associated with it. Because if it does, then it's really easy to update. So I'm going to apt list -- installed because apt is the default package manager on Debian. If you're using a different Linux distro, that might be yum instead of apt, in which case your command would be yum list installed. However, since I'm using apt, I'll say apt list installed. And that will actually give me a list of all of the packages that are on my machine. Now let's see if within those packages, if vsftpd is one of them. So I'm going to take the output from that command. I'm going to pipe it with this pipe operator into grep, and I'm going to use grep to search for vsftpd. Searching that, it doesn't seem like anything popped up. Now, if something did pop up, like for example, if I saw vsftpd here, then the only thing I would have to do to upgrade the service is run apt upgrade with the service name. So for example, or with the package name, I should say. So for example, if I saw vsftpd pop up here, in order to upgrade it, I'd have to run sudo apt upgrade vsftpd. However, in this case, it looks like vsftpd is not installed as a package, so it's going to take a few extra steps to figure out where it's actually located. The first thing I want to do is I want to find the location of the actual binary that is running the vsftpd service. How do I go about doing that? Well, I'm going to start by listing the open ports and the processes that are associated with those ports. To do that, I can either use netstat if you're on some distributions of Linux, or SS if you're on others. Since I'm on the latest version of Debian, the proper command is SS. If you're using netstat, the flags for the command are exactly the same. The only difference is you'd use netstat instead of SS. Anyway, if I run SS with -plunt, that lists the listening TCP and UDP ports. It also will print the process that's associated with that port. You might notice we don't actually see any processes associated with the port. That's because I have to run this again with root privileges, so I'm going to prefix that with sudo. This time you'll see that along with open ports, we get a process ID for the process that's associated with that port. I can once again use grep, pipe that output into grep, to search specifically for port 21, which is running this FTP service. Searching for port 21, you can kind of see it at the top here. You'll notice that it has a process ID of 524. So now that we know the process ID of that process, we can start gaining more information about that process. The first thing I want to do, as I mentioned before, is figure out where the actual executable that is being run is located. So if the way I can do that is by listing out, so I'll do ls-l and /proc / the process ID, which in this case is 524, /exe. Exe is actually a link to the binary that the process is running. And by using ls-l, we can then print out where that link points to. So once again, in order to actually print that out, I need to prefix this with sudo to run this as root. And now you'll see that this proc 524exe is actually a link to user local sbin vsftpd. So that means the actual binary that's responsible for this vsftpd service is located in user local sbin vsftpd. The second thing that would be nice to know is I want to know the full command that's being run to start this vsftpd service. The reason I want to know and take note of this full command is in case I try to update to a newer version and something doesn't work, something breaks, I can always come back and I can always rerun this older version, and at least I know it works. Even though it's vulnerable, at least it's better to have something that's working than something that's not working, right? So in order to know how this is being run, I want to see the full command line that's being used to run vsftpd. To find that, I'm going to use the ps command to list out processes and more information about the processes. I'm going to use -eo, which is going to allow me to print out specific information that I want to view about the process. So I'm going to need to print out the process ID because that's how I'm going to search for it. And I want to print out maybe the user that's running that process, and I want to print out the actual command that's being run. Then I'm once again going to do what I did before, pipe that output into grep so I can search for something specific, and I'm going to specifically search for process ID 524. Running that, you'll notice that the root user is running process 524, and that the full command is just the path to vsftpd. So it's user local sbin vsftpd. So that means if we wanted to run that again, if something didn't work out and we were to go back and rerun this older version, all we'd have to do is switch to root. So I can do that with sudo and run user local sbin vsftpd. Okay, so now that we know where that binary is located and how it's being run, the first step is to kill that currently running instance of vsftpd. So because we don't want it running anymore, because we're going to actually upgrade it and replace it with a newer version. So in order to do that, I'm going to again, as root, so sudo, use the kill command to kill process 524. And now we can double check by printing out processes again, and now you'll notice that process is no longer present. Another thing I can do really quickly is run ss-plunt to list our listening ports again and search for 21. And we should see that port 21 is not found anymore because, again, FTP is no longer running. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change the permissions on that binary in user local sbin vsftpd so that nobody can run it and so that it's not accidentally run by mistake. So I'm going to say sudo chmod 000, that's going to remove all permissions from that binary, user local sbin vsftpd. Now if I were to try running it again, you'll notice I can't. It tells me command not found. And the reason for that is because even as root, we do not have permissions to actually run that binary file. I recommend this over fully removing that file because, again, let's say you do try to update vsftp and for some reason the update doesn't work out and you can't get it working, you can always come back. You can switch the permissions back with sudo chmod 755 user local sbin vsftpd, and then you could just rerun it and get it back up and running again. However, now that that's done, the next thing we want to do is install a newer version of vsftpd. And we could either go online and try to download it from online, or we can hope that Debian is going to have a package with that service. So I can actually say apt search, and I can search for any packages named vsftpd. And when I search for that package, you'll notice that there is, in fact, a package called vsftpd. And you can see the version of vsftpd is 3.0.3, which is newer than 2.3.4, so that vulnerability that we took advantage of as attackers is now going to be patched. If I want to install it, I can just say sudo apt install vsftpd. And this might take some time, but when it's all done and installed, then we'll have the latest version of vsftpd. One thing it's asking is if I want to keep my currently installed configuration file or if I want to install the new one. I'm going to keep the currently installed configuration because who knows if there are some changes made in that configuration file that I have that are necessary for how this is set up. So just to be safe, we're going to keep it and select End. For any services that are installed through apt, it's very likely that there's going to be a systemd service that's associated with it. And so a lot of the times you'll be able to run these services using systemd. This applies to almost every service in modern Linux. So if I installed a package called vsftpd, my guess would be that now I'm going to have a service available called vsftpd. I can check that with systemctl or system control status vsftpd. You'll notice I do in fact have a service called vsftpd. It's the vsftpd FTP server, and it is active and running. If it wasn't running, I could always start it with sudo systemctl start vsftpd, and that would start it. The other thing I will do is I'll make sure that this runs when the system reboots. So if for whatever reason we end up having to reboot our machine, the next time we start it, we don't have to manually restart the service. It'll be started on boot automatically. So I'll say sudo systemctl enable vsftpd. And now that's done, we can check and see if it is in fact listening on port 21 with ss-plunt. We'll again search for 21. And now you'll notice that it is again listening on port 21, but hopefully this time we're running a newer version of that vsftpd service that is no longer vulnerable. In summary, I know this was a lot of steps. It's a lot easier if there's a package installed and all you have to do is update the package. If that's the case, once again, you would yum update package or apt update package, right? If you don't find a package installed, it takes a few additional steps because you actually have to kill the process that's running the service, right? Then you have to make that file unrunnable by changing the permissions. And then you have to install a newer version of that service and run it. So this is kind of the hardcore mode of getting a newer version of a service set up, but a lot of the times it's as easy as just simply saying apt update vsftpd or yum update vsftpd. Anyway, going back to our attacking machine and looking at that service now, I'm going to run that same nmap scan that I ran before. So I'm going to scan port 21, I'm going to get the version of the service, and I'm going to run the default nmap scripts. Now that I run that, you'll notice that there's one big difference from last time we ran that nmap scan. And this time, when we look at the version of the service, it's actually vsftpd 3.0.3. This version of the service is no longer vulnerable.